The British considered the conflict between themselves and their German and Italian enemies a European war fought in Africa. Then Britain's allies the Americans got into the fray. They landed their mighty force of American men, vehicles and supplies in North Africa to link up with the British. In November of 1942, they called it Operation Torch a Captive. Just 6 months after landing in Africa, marching with groups assembled in a makeshift POW compound, we were herded. Like a massive cattle drive toward trucks, once again we would make a journey, but to where? This was of vital importance. All around me guys muttered their concern like snapping turtles in a twofold pond. I got to know, I mumbled, asked the guard. A kid named Bernard pleaded. Another guy added his encouragement, you look harmless, antenna ears, maybe the guards won't hurt you. At that moment I realized I didn't care. I wasn't afraid of the British anymore. I thought the enemy had already done their worst to me. What more could they do? A risk-taker by nature, I thought I might as well draw on the cultured English I had learned in school. I squeezed to the front. I addressed a guard with perfect English pronunciation and tonalities. Where are we going? To the port of Tunis, he said flatly. The sea, I quickly translated for my buddy's eye. Couldn't believe my good fortune for a second. I smelled the heady mixture of sweat on sunburned skin and salty sea air that had been such a part of my childhood. Being near the sea again was almost like going home. I couldn't wait to see the Mediterranean. My heart pounded with excitement. Then I refocused on the British guard in front of me. Reality struck hard. This was no summer vacation, or even a day trip to the beach, seaside or not. This was war. About an hour later the transports dropped us off at the harbor. Obviously we were going to be relocated somewhere by ship. I twisted around for a last peek at Tunis as we clambered aboard our assigned coastal freighter. Where is this ship headed? I boldly asked a guard on board. I wanted my friends to know that I could be relied on. To Algiers, he said. Man, totally disappointed. I told an old guy named Tillman standing next to me. We're just going to another African country. What did you expect? Tillman sneered. Spain. German sarcasm at its finest. While fleeing, he and some others had hoped to commandeer boats at Cape Bond. If we could have made it to Spain, the Spanish would have helped them get home. The Spanish government had come out on top in a civil war that ended in 1939. They had secretly shored up their troops with the strength of German soldiers. Our guards, British soldiers, herded about 100 of us down to the hold of the ship. The hatch clanged and banged over our heads as the guards fastened it down. We're stowed down here like a bunch of sorry rats, Tillman said, his eyes bugging out in panic. His friend Frank chimed in. If we get torpedoed by one of our own submarines, we don't stand a chance. We'll go down like rats. Ha! An older man retorted. We haven't got submarines in the Mediterranean. Hitler doesn't consider this area important enough to deploy submarines. The men around me visibly relaxed. I didn't believe it. From what I remembered of Hitler's activities in the past, he definitely considered this sea important. How long is this trip going to take, do you think? Bernard asked me. He huddled on the cold metal floor close by me. I calculate a day or two. I tried to make myself comfortable against the war. Bernard had marched along beside me and had looked fine up until now. When our ocean voyage began, he became morose. What will they do to us? I don't know, I admitted, feeling a little morose myself, but we must be brave for the sake of our families. Bernard pulled out his wallet and showed me a picture of himself with some army buddies. These were my friends and now they're all dead, he said, tears welling in his eyes. He ripped the photo to pieces. I don't care about anything anymore. The freighter soon cleared its moorings and steered on a course running parallel to the coast of Algiers. The floor got harder and colder as I tried to stay out of the way of men who were seasick. It was ironic in a way that the pitches and yaws of the ship making the men seasick just made me feel homesick. If I could have had one wish, I would have let my family know that I was all right. I prayed that they were all right too. Eventually we heard the screws of the engines grind to a stop and the slap 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 of the waves against the side. What would we face topside in Algiers? Instead of the Americans whom we expected, armed British soldiers waited for us. Where are we going? I asked again in English for myself as well as for my buddies. To a prisoner of war camp, you little Jerry, the god said with a small humorless laugh as the prisoners, some still retching, some helped by their friends, came down the gangplank. Our British escort organized us into marching formations. I gave the sea one last lingering look before heading off to the desert. Once again we marched a lot when we were with the British. They were not motorized like the Americans. We called the British soldiers the slang term. They called themselves Tommies. As they marched us along, the Tommies sang. One song was from a Scottish unit that wore headgear with a red decoration on the top. One verse went like this: what made the Jerrys run? It was not the Tommy gun, it was the cherry on their bonnet, the bloody cherry on it. Other than rubbing our noses in their victory, the British were decent chaps, allowing an occasional break on our hot day-long march. As we made our way to another camp, they often shared their water. We finally arrived at the kind of POW camp that became part of my life for the next several years. 2 rows of barbed wire fences and watchtowers. Before we settled and the British interrogated each prisoner, I figured out later that they wanted to make certain that high-ranking or dangerous prisoners did not slip undetected through the registration process. When my turn came, an officer asked me for my sold book or soldier's booklet, a condensed personnel file. It contained data like my weight, height, birth date, and birthplace, as well as the names and address of my parents and records of my vaccinations and eye examinations. It also recorded my military training units, transfers, and duties. A space for promotions was there too, but mine was blank. My photo and my signature were inside the cover. The officer went over my identification with me, as well as my rank and the type of unit I was in. Apparently he concluded I was neither dangerous nor high-ranking. He closed the booklet and handed it back, saying that will be all. I saluted, clicked my heels, and executed a quick about face and an even quicker exit toward the latrine. My insides were churning. I was sick, dysentery, feverish, dehydrated, and bleeding. I told an NCO about my problem. Obviously I needed medical attention, so he sent me to a British field hospital on the coast. I walked, of course, with 2 young British guards as escorts. The 3 of us ambled along nicely. Even though I felt weak and wobbly, I was having a nice conversation with one of them until the other one poked me in the ribs with his gun and said, "Give me your watch." I got scared. We were alone on a street in a strange city. No one was in authority was watching. In fact, I didn't even see any natives about. These Tommies could do anything to me they wanted and no one would care. I took off the expensive Swiss watch my parents had given to me on my 16th birthday and handed it to him. "Your wallet," he said. "Can I keep the pictures of my family?" He nodded. My hands shook, but I removed the pictures of my family and held out the wallet. "Now your soldier's book," he said, and then added with a sly look on his face, "Where are your medals?" "I never got any. I'm just a private," I told him. He patted me down. Didn't find anything else. Reluctantly I gave him my booklet. My meager possessions were now his trophies, his greed, my loss. I thought with bitterness. Without personal identification, I really felt like a nobody. Since childhood I had carried a wallet with my identification and enough money to get home. By the age of 13 I even carried a series of youth association membership cards with my identification. Papers to prove who you were or were not had been a matter of survival in Hitler's Germany. People were known to live or die according to the completeness of their papers. Now I was a long way from home and for the first time completely defenseless, with no proof of who I was or even where I came from. My head pounded. I had cramps and malaise. I wanted to get away from the trophy hunter and to lie down. The hospital cots with their smooth, clean sheets felt like a piece of heaven. But just as I got comfortable, an attack by a German submarine in the harbor resulted in more injured men, which led to the evacuation of all the non-critical cases in the hospital. I remembered my buddies in the hold of the ship had convinced themselves that there weren't any subs in the Mediterranean. During the evacuation, the British carted me off to a train depot. I found myself on an American-controlled train going westward into the middle of Africa. On the train I was astonished to be treated as well as any Allied soldier. British and American servicemen as well as POW patients like me were also on the train. I thought it ironic that as we passed through Allies-friendly French Algeria, the townsfolk waved French, British and American flags, not knowing that they were heralding German POWs too. We POW patients disembarked in Oran, Algeria and transported to an American field hospital, a quiet, orderly place that felt immediately familiar. Seeing doctors, taking medicine and convalescing had been part of my life since childhood. During my infancy I had rickets, attributed to my mother's starvation during the British blockade of Germany in World War I. In my hometown, rickets was commonly referred to as the British disease. My bones shattered easily and healed slowly. My gentle, kindly pediatrician, who happened to be Jewish, used to say I had glass bones. Jaundice had been another problem that needed my doctor's care. His treatment succeeded. The sickly child grew to healthy adolescence, so healthy I'd passed all the military physicals with high marks. I was skinny but snapped back from injury and hardship with the freshness of youth. At the American Field Hospital I awoke one day feeling a lot better, but with the realization that I had lost track of time. "What's the date today?" I asked a nice American nurse. "The 9th. June 9th, 1943, she added for emphasis. Probably thought I had shell shock or something. I bolted upright. "Wow, I had a birthday 2 days ago and I didn't even know it." I said, "How old are you now, kid?" She asked. "You look about 14. 19. I said proudly. "If I were home my mother would bake a birthday cake for me," I added. The nurse turned to leave and we'd have a party, I said to her. Retreating back I could see that she was slowly shaking her head. Was it disbelief or sorrow? I couldn't tell. Her pained reaction started me thinking maybe she questioned why I had to be so far from home on my birthday, why all of us sick and injured boys, Axis and Allies alike, were so far from home. During my quiet, relatively comfortable convalescence I began to question it too. What was I doing here? Why were we fighting in the first place? I had been obedient out of training and habit. I did what I was told and marched Where I was ordered without question, now suddenly I realized that I couldn't let things just happen anymore. My survival was up to me. I had already used up a large share of good luck or God's grace, depending how you looked at it, in 6 months of combat. The only injuries I had suffered were infections from the cactus thorns and scorpion bites in my legs, and from the small load of shrapnel in my back. Landing in an American hospital in the relative lap of luxury had used up better fortune. I found myself recovering from dysentery much faster than I wished. How could I delay my return to the POW camp? In desperation I asked men more ill than I for their stools. You want my, they said, and then grinned. Well, go ahead, take all you want. A little victory. They happily shared their loose stools, which I needed for the daily laboratory tests. But by midsummer I looked so hale and hearty. But not even this deception worked. The doctor judged me healthy and discharged me from the hospital. The Americans sent me back to a power of camp in Iran, where tens of thousands of POWs were funner led in by train. The enormous camp was the embarkation point to permanent captivity. To my surprise, black French African troops guarded us. The only blacks I had ever seen in my life were some of the foreign sailors in my hometown. Like the sailors, the guards simply had a job to do and were doing it. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the white French officers. These officers, whose country had been defeated and was occupied by Germany, clearly wanted to pay us back. Their glares and sneers conveyed personal grudges against us. They made it clear that they were going to make our lives as miserable as possible. Every day in the French-run camp, the POWs swayed in line during long roll calls in the heat. Many prisoners collapsed, yet somehow I grew stronger. Despite the scorching heat, the taunts, I found strength in the face of adversity. God was with me still. My family was with me too. I remembered their faces, their last goodbyes, and my father's eyes when he had ordered me to come back home. With dry throat and dust clogging my nostrils, I stood in the wavering roll call lines and called out encouragingly to the men next to me, flex your knees, take deep breaths. Think about cool mountain air. My father would have done no less. Later in our tents, rumors circulated to get the latest information. I sought out Tillman, the old jerk on the freighter. He always managed to know what was going on. I joined a conversation he was having with his pal Frank. The British and the Americans are trying to figure out how to make the best use of all of our manpower. Deep furrows creased Tillman's forehead. I expect we'll be shipped out to work in their factories and on their farms pretty soon. What an inglorious end for the Africa course, I thought. Then I heard something alarming. We're going to be given to the French for the rest of the war, Frank said. I overheard some French guards talking about it. They're going to work us like slaves in their African mines. Tillman's horror reflected mine. I just knew something bad like this would happen. Tillman didn't seem like such a jerk anymore. What an awful fate for an old guy, I thought. I wondered if he'd make it. I wondered if I could. I went looking for my new buddy Albert, whom I had gotten to know when we were patients at the American Field Hospital. He was 20 years old, a quiet little guy whose uniform always looked neat and whose chestnut brown hair always looked perfectly combed. I sidled up and quietly told him the rumor. I'll get claustrophobia if I have to work down in a mine, I said. Albert nodded. Yeah, I know. I don't want to spend any more time in the ground. I even hated being down in a trench. There's got to be a way out, I told Albert while we discussed this latest rumor about French mining camps. The scheduled American roll call began several times a week. Americans came into our French-run camp and called out a list of POW names. The men thus chosen assembled at the entrance gate and boarded U.S. Army trucks, never to be seen again. I heard a rumor that they're going to the United States, Tillman said. Wow, I thought, how did they get so lucky? More importantly, how could I make some of that luck for myself? It came to me as the Americans called out the last of the German names. Albert the first whispered, you know how the French treat us and you know how the Americans have treated us. He nodded eagerly. He knew I was brewing something up. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement myself. I say, let's go with the Americans, I said. But are those guys whose names are called really headed for America, or are they going somewhere else? Albert was no fool. We didn't have much time to decide. It was now or never. Let's do it, I spoke. He nodded a sharp yes. A few days later, when the Americans called another list of names, Albert and I managed to linger close to the assembling group. Although our names were not called, we casually joined the line of POWs and melted in with them. We hopped on a truck with the others and were unloaded without incident at the harbor in Oran, where a convoy of Liberty ships was anchored. So far so good, Albert the first muttered before looking up to see the guards begin a search of the POWs. It crossed my mind that maybe it had been a stroke of luck that my identification book had been stolen. Albert's had been taken by the Tommies. To make sure you take everything shiny away from them, said the sergeant of the guards. I whispered a translation to Albert. The guards took our canteens, eating utensils and mirrors, and threw the monopile. I looked at the growing pile and thought, more trophies for the Allied non-combatants. All I was left with was the sweaty uniform on my back. They never questioned who we were. We passed undetected. Why did they want shiny stuff? Albert asked later. Maybe they think we can use them for signaling German ships. German submarines roamed the ocean like sharks in the fall of 1943. Nerves roar and tension spent, we spouted sarcastic comments about the absurdity of an army private making contact with them. Know any maritime codes, Albert? Nah, and even if I did, I don't want us to get torpedoed along with the other small group of selected POWs. Albert and I boarded a freighter under a Norwegian merchant marine captain. U.S. Navy destroyers escorted our big convoy of Liberty ships. Our captain saw to it that each of us got a U.S. Army blanket since we had to sleep on the metal floor of the hold. He announced the rules: only 50% of you at a time can be on deck during daylight. At night you will be closed into the hold. No bathroom facilities existed down under, so it was quite a relief to go topside every morning. The stench below was nauseating. Once on deck I was allowed to climb a ladder to get some fresh air and watch the crew work. I spoke English with the American guards, who looked friendly. I asked them questions about where we were and tried to figure out our position by scanning the coastline. In the afternoon I stayed down below and tried to console Albert. The poor guy suffered terribly from motion sickness and stayed below most of the time. Albert had a litany of complaints when he wasn't retching. African mines would have been a picnic compared to this. Why did you talk me into it? I wish I hadn't listened to you. Soon our ship was running close to the Spanish coastline. We must be approaching the Straits of Gibraltar, I thought. Shouts in 2 languages rang out above. Why did you talk me into it? I wish I hadn't listened to you. Soon our ship was running close to the Spanish coastline. We must be approaching the Straits of Gibraltar, I thought. Shouts in 2 languages rang out above. I scrambled up the ladder and cocked my head out of the hatch. Bernard, the boy I met on the freighter, was bending over the rail for a good look. What's going on? I asked. 2 of our men dove overboard and are swimming towards Spain, Bernard said, but they aren't making much headway. The cross currents here are too strong. They're probably going to drown. Yells of encouragement welled up from our men on the deck. What's happening now? I asked. A destroyer spotted them and they're throwing out life rings. A cheer went up. They've latched on. They're pulling them on board. More cheers. They're all right now, Bernard said. Albert was all ears. I wish I would have jumped overboard, he whimpered. His face was the color of the metal floor. I bet they're going to be treated a lot better on that destroyer than we are in this hole. I've never seen anyone dive and puke at the same time, I said, giving Albert a playful poke on the shoulder. Can you even swim? God in heaven, Albert said. He rolled his eyes and leaned against the wall with his back to me. Poor Albert, he was so physically weak that he could barely climb up the ladder to get his water ration, much less swim. He had lost a great deal of weight because he was seldom able to eat. Our food consisted of cold sea rations out of the can, pieces of wood from packing crates were our spoons. We cleaned out the empty food cans for the water ladled out to us on deck. We had to drink what we could right there. Only an acrobat could climb vertical ladders with one hand and hold an open can of water with the other. However, the problems we had with food and drink were of minor significance compared to the possibility of being blown out of the water by our own navy. Since the ship we were on was not identified as carrying German prisoners, we worried as much as the Americans about German submarines torpedoing us. AGI told me that their troops needed entertainment to get their minds off the danger and boost morale. He asked me if the POWs who were taking their turn down in the hold would sing. It never occurred to me at the time, but I heard later on that the American sailors hoped German subs could hear the German words and songs and therefore would not attack when they realized the ship carried a load of Germans. They realized this was true. Our singing may have saved our lives. One tune the American GIS asked for was the song of the German Submarine Corps. It has sung Fortissimo, a war song full of boom boom booms. The Americans also liked the colonial African song Heya Safari. How often have we walked on narrow native trails through the steppe when the cool evening neared? How did we listen to the sounds, the well-known songs of the carriers and Ascaris native soldiers? Heya Heya Safari. Sometimes the Norwegian sailors asked for the World War II version as well. They even asked us to sing the rousing song of the Afrika Korps, but their favorite was the melancholy love song Lily Marlene, discovered by German soldiers when they stormed a Yugoslavian radio station in Belgrade. We sang it in German. The sailors knew it in English. Singing soothed us. We felt less nervous, especially when we sang at the tops of our lungs. Even the GIs looked calmer as they listened to our 50 choirs. They appreciated our music so much that candy and cigarettes rained down on us from the deck after each song. Later I realized that the shower of gifts was to keep us singing. Our trip took longer in wartime than it would have in peacetime because the convoy steered a zigzag course to put off the submarines day after day. The minute I hit the deck I searched the horizon for signs of land. We sailed for a grueling 3 weeks. Everyone cheered when seagulls were sighted, indicating that land was close. Our nerve-wracking journey was coming to an end. A huge statue of a robed lady with a torch appeared in the horizon, the Statue of Liberty. We taunted our German submarines with one last chorus of their song. I shouted out the ending with a lusty boom. The inscription on the Statue of Liberty was too far off for me to see, but I knew that it read, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these the homeless tempest tossed to shore. Send lift my lamp beside the golden door, my wretched bodies," and I fit the description. Homeless, yes, tempest tossed definitely. And I would have given anything to be free from our captors, from Hitler, and also from the German army which had pulled the rug out from under us. The door to America was open, but I felt far from welcome when we finally disembarked on Ellis Island, New York. At Ellis Island we were shown to shower rooms with luxurious foaming soap, thick clean towels, and hot water, freshly scrubbed, shampooed, shaven, and deloused. We were even given clean new undergarments. "Throw away the Nazi direct," said a grinning guard while we scrubbed GIs, cleaned up, and disinfected our uniforms. This was more hospitality than we expected. I was glad to be rid of my coating of grime and was aching to be settled somewhere after we cleaned up sufficiently. Another guard pointed us toward a train. Albert and I boarded Pullman cars along with hundreds of other POWs. Each of us had his own upholstered seat. "See how much better America is already. This is a big improvement over German freight cars," I whispered to Albert. He was his old self again, though a bit weak, and he nodded his head in agreement. He was eyeing the MPS military police, who were on guard at each end of the car. They were uniformed smartly and fully equipped with submachine guns. The MPS told us the rules: stay seated, you are not allowed to walk around, raise your hand if you need to use the restroom. We may have felt like kindergartners, but Albert and I were the most comfortable we had been in months. His seasickness was gone. The motion of the train didn't bother him. He could finally eat again. Polite black porters served as meals. It may have been ordinary fare to Americans, but the food looked like a banquet to us. Fruit juice, hamburgers, French fries, and real coffee. A few days later, while I munched and relaxed, I looked out the window and saw a sign: Texarkana, a city whose name I recognized. "Look at that, Albert. I'll bet we're on our way to Texas." Albert's eyes lit up. He pressed his nose against the window for a better look. We had both seen plenty of cowboy and Indian movies, and I had read English translations of lots of westerns as a schoolboy. "This might not be so bad after all," Albert said. "From my grammar school geography, I remembered that Texarkana was on the Arkansas-Texas border. The name had fascinated me. Sure enough, our long train ride cluttered to a halt on a hot fall day in 1943 in the small town of Herner, Texas. We clambered off the train and marched to a new compound of barracks. The Americans warmly welcomed us. "Howdy y'all, come on us." Howdy ushered us toward the bathrooms for hot showers before they served us an American meal of potato salad, bread, hot dogs, carrots, celery sticks, and ice cream in the mess hall. When we finished our food, the U.S. Army sergeant said, "Now you're going to be processed." I quickly translated this for the guys around me. "They want us to line up." I had been dreading this. Surely if we were to be caught, this would be the time, but the American procedure was far more casual than I could have imagined. By the time we got to the United States, the U.S. Army had processed over 100,000 Axis POWs, more than their pre-war total of American soldiers. I didn't have any identification. Would the Americans think I was trying to hide something? Should I tell them that British soldiers stole my German soldiers' book? I decided that the truth might make matters worse. The Americans' idea of processing looked like the perfect place for a European criminal to create a new identity. I worried that they would not try to sort the Nazis out from the rest of us. Heated political arguments I overheard on the ship convinced me that the Nazis still felt powerful, not only in Germany but in our midst. I could only hope the Americans understood that German POWs had major political differences. As I moved down the line, I got even more worried. I could tell that German-English interpreters were few and far between. The Americans didn't know whom they were dealing with. I saw that they left the German military branches intact: Army, Navy, and Air Force. They followed the rules of the Geneva Convention and segregated the officers from the enlisted men. Thus rabid Nazis slipped by unnoticed until they maimed or killed fellow POWs whom they considered anti-Nazi or disloyal to the party. All I could do was wait and see what happened next. First a typical Army medical examination, then the assignment of a serial number for the rest of my internment. When I told the Americans that I was German and a veteran of Rommel's Africa course captured in North Africa, they gave me the designation of 81G285 Federal. My processes supplied me with a 3-page basic personnel record to fill out with the same information as my stolen German one. Later on I heard that copies of the numbers and forms were forwarded to the International Red Cross in Switzerland so that our families would be notified if anything worse happened to us. Next came fingerprint cards and photographs. An inventory of personal effects came after that. All I had left were pictures of my family, which were worth more to me than gold. The personal effects page stayed blank. The last step in the processing was the best. I was motioned to a supply window to pick up a new uniform. I could hardly believe that the full duffel bag tossed over the counter was just for me. 4 pairs of trousers, 2 in cotton and 2 in wool, a bet 5 short sleeve and long sleeve shirts in khaki denim and wool, and socks, underwear, gloves, a jacket, a coat, a raincoat, a cap, and new shoes. Albert was as happy as I was to get new clothes and couldn't wait to get to our barracks to put them on. A supply sergeant said in bad German, "In your barracks you will find white paint and a stencil of the letters PW. Paint the letters PW on your uniforms, the backs of your shirts and jackets, the fronts of your trousers, and on the sides of your shirts and pants." I wish I didn't have to put paint on them. Albert said everything is so clean and fresh. Think of it this way, Albert, these are way better than the ragged, torn up uniforms we left behind on our last retreat. Yeah, guy behind me said, and the white paint makes a perfect target for the American guards too. Your Teutonic mind is overworked, I told him. The idiot, I thought, why would the Americans bring us all this way just to shoot us? In my naivete, I couldn't foresee how the interplay between ordinary POWs like us and the Nazis would clash with our young guards. They probably thought all of us were Nazis. We were allowed to keep our German uniforms to wear inside the camp on holidays according to the regulations of the Geneva Convention. As I washed mine and put it in the bottom of my duffel bag, I thought that I never wanted to see it again. Little did I know that I would put it on one more time for a show of respect at a funeral in an American POW camp for 2 of my closest buddies. During the slack time in processing, I listened to my fellow prisoners tell their stories. The men ranged in age from 19 to 40 and had been trained in vocational schools and technical colleges. Skilled school teachers, stonemasons, electricians, and every other profession were represented. The Third Reich had abruptly terminated the civilian jobs in which they had taken pride. They knew they were lucky to have survived the Africa campaign, yet they did not feel completely relieved. All of their physical and mental energy had been spent fighting. Now that they were idle, they were worried, homesick, anxious, depressed, and angry by turns. Many had left wives and children behind in Germany and despaired over their fate. The men suffered from barbed wire sickness. They felt powerless to help themselves, let alone their loved ones. Some of the older men tried to pull themselves together in order to comfort others. Feeling more homesick than ever before, we tried to find friends who came from the same home areas. Those who spoke the same dialect would know the same town's heroes, folklore, and songs. I listened for the pronunciation familiar to my area and found my group. We would be able to stay in the same barracks. I learned in a lecture at the end of our processing day. The camp commander said to us through an interpreter, we must all make the best of the situation. He explained the rules, medical and dental services, and how to write and send letters home. He ended by explaining the punishment that would be enforced for escapes or intended escapes: isolation in the stockade for a length of time that would be determined by the type of offense. Then he dismissed us to find our new homes. A man named Ralph came from Hamburg, a city close to my hometown. He was a quiet older man who had been a teacher. We headed out toward our new barracks, located somewhere in the group of drabs black tar paper barracks. The camp was divided into 3 compounds. Each compound consisted of 20 barracks as well as mess halls, a workshop, a canteen, an infirmary, an administrative building, and a recreation hall. A barack was 20 feet by 100 feet and consisted of a concrete slab floor and structure of wood 2x4s covered with tar paper. The Army Corps of Engineers used this same plan in all 155 POW camps constructed. Rolf scanned our barack. It's not the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, but since we're in a small town we can't expect much, even so I think we should reserve rooms. What a joker that Roth, New York's most famous hotel, was owned by a German immigrant named Waldorf. Do you think they have room service? I couldn't resist. We soon found out that the locals who lived near such camps didn't think we had anything to joke about. They thought we had it too good. They called POW camps the Fritz Ritz. Inside each barack were about 100 cots in rows with hooks along the wall for hanging up our issued clothes and our duffel bags. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the center aisle. Rolf and I found 2 empty cots next to each other. After the few minutes it took to stow our gear, we flopped down on the cots. I stared up at the ceiling. Now reality set in. Here I was, a teenager in a prisoner of war, complete with serial number. I thought about what my parents would be expecting of me in such circumstances. They were practical people who had lived through 2 wars. They never panicked. I, as well as my sister, had learned to cope with wartime conditions from following their examples, but neither parent could have predicted this outcome and prepared me for captivity. I could not shake off my feelings of foreboding. I sat up on the edge of my bunk and stared into space. Let's check this place out. This came from Rolf. He was really old, about 35, but he always surprised me with his energy, which was catching. He went outside. I followed him. Walkways, gravel roads, and a wide flat area LED. Beyond our compound we could see 2 other compounds of about 20 barracks each. The compound held a washroom and an open field for inspections and sports. Beyond the fences we could see the hospital, chapel, UDS post office, and what looked like a warehouse. The camp looked like any other army camp, but it had one major difference: we were surrounded by a double set of barbed wire fences 10 feet high. We were observed from watchtowers with power searchlights to keep even better tabs on us. A single barbed wire fence isolated the individual compounds. We could see the young GI guards scowling at us and wondered how well trained they were for the job. We joked back and forth about the fact that they looked like kids had never left their mummies. I saw fear in their eyes when they looked at us. They saw dangerous fighters, soldiers who would stop at nothing to kill or escape. In reality, the only thing Rolf and I were fighting was depression. We were prisoners of the enemy in the enemy's country, a situation never covered in our army training manual. I resolved to keep my wits about me. I wanted to go home to see my family again. I found it hard to understand or trust the fact that the Americans were so generous with food, clothing, and shelter. I asked Ralph what he thought about it. He pulled his pipe and tobacco out of his pocket. I think they're practicing the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He lit his pipe before he continued. You know there are American POWs in Germany. You mean that the Americans hope that if they treat us well that Germany will hear about it and do the same? I asked. Yes, I'm sure I've asked. Yes, boggled the mind. Obviously they knew little about the SS, Hitler's private army, which controlled the entire war effort. I was certain that the godless SS didn't even know the golden rule they made there. The godless aside, we had other problems. The worst was the heat and the humidity of Hearne, Texas. As enlisted men, Rolf and I got strenuous job assignments. We had both grown up in the cool northern coastal climate of Germany and Denmark. I had never become accustomed to the hot days and cold nights of North Africa. It astonished me that this new POW camp in Texas was even hotter than North Africa. Hard labor in the Texas sun was grueling, but if I didn't work, I didn't get paid. The stuff I could buy with the little bit of money I earned each day meant a lot to me. A Coke, a candy bar, and cigarettes. I enjoyed them as I read news of the outside world free of charge via the New York Times. My daily ordeal began at 5:30. Reveille. 6 U.S. breakfast of bread and jam and a strange food called cornflakes. In Germany only animals ate corn. 6:30. Shave, shower, clean the barracks. 7:30. Roll call and work assignments. Hard physical work under the broiling sun, mowing, raking, and weeding the enormous grounds. 12. Brown bag lunch out in the field. A sample menu was typically potato salad, roast pork, carrot sticks, and ice water. 1 more hard work under the sun until quitting time at 4:30. A lot of men collapsed from heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Those of us still mobile at supper at 6. Goal. A typical menu was meatloaf, scrambled eggs, milk, and bread. Not exactly my mother's cooking, but at least I filled my stomach completely for the first time in years. The scourge of the heat and the strong sun created a cottage industry. Since the caps the U.S. Army supply didn't keep the sun out of our eyes, some of the men in my labor group set up a little business of making broad-billed caps out of our heavy cotton mattress covers. Their design was original and practical. Hard-working enlisted men placed orders and bought them with their own money. The caps gave us identity. I put mine on my head at a cocky angle. We were a hardy and resourceful bunch. I adjusted to the heat often. I was one of the few men left standing at the end of the day. One day I was rewarded with duty outside the camp fences, hacking weeds with a big sharp scythe along the main road. I lashed my way down to a crossroads when a car came toward me and stopped. I looked back at my group spread out on both sides of the road. Some distance back, the guard had his back to road. An old man leaned out the window of the car and called to me, "Howdy, which way is the POW camp?" "Right down the road behind me," I said politely in my best English, "and you might like to know I'm one of them." He gave me a startled look and sped off in a shower of gravel. I looked down at my clothes with POW stenciled in white in every conspicuous spot and had to chuckle. That was my only light moment at work on those hot early days in camp. NCOs, non-commissioned officers from sergeant up to lieutenant, were treated differently from U.S. enlisted men. NCOs were given the job of running the camp internally. They did not have to do any other work unless they wanted more pay than their weekly dole of $3. The NCOs put their minds to all kinds of projects. To this day, photographs can be found in military archives that testify to their ingenuity. At the camp in Hearne, the NCOs designed and erected a perfect scale model of one of King Ludwig's Bavarian castles, complete with stairs and a working moat. They mixed and poured tons of donated cement and converted everyday objects into doors, windows, and embellishments. Germans and Americans alike admired the workmanship of these inventive men who used their skills to keep mentally alert and physically active. Not all activity in the camp was as benign or straightforward. The majority of Germans held captive were battle-hardened veterans of the Africa campaign. Although Germany was taking heavy losses on the Eastern Front and the air war over Germany had intensified, there was still a strong allegiance toward our homeland and our government and a belief in victory. I had quietly discarded my belief in a German victory after seeing the overwhelming amount of war material Owned by the Allies in North Africa. My observations on our train ride from New York to Texas as we passed cities industrious by day and fully lit at night added to my skepticism. No blackouts here. The Americans didn't worry about getting bombed in Germany. They worried about it day and night. It had become common knowledge that the camp in Herne was one of more than 150 such camps where PALs were sent. In addition, we heard that there were about 500 branch camps. If the abundance of supplies in a small camp like Hayon was typical, Germany was doomed. I often told myself I was probably in the best place I could be under the circumstances. I could be starved or tortured or fighting in God knew what conditions. Then I'd see the barbed wire fences surrounding me and I wasn't sure how I hated that barbed wire. However, it never occurred to me to escape. Although I spoke English, where could I go? I certainly couldn't get back to Germany. Someone else tried to escape, though probably from a sense of duty. A tough die-hard. He wore civilian clothing over his German uniform. His military training did him in, however, because as he walked along a country road he sang German marching songs to keep up his courage. A farm woman heard him and turned him in. Some people deserve their fate. According to reports, fewer than 1% of the 360,000 German POWs escaped. Most of the escapees were apprehended within 24 hours. Large camps experienced no more than 3 to 4 escapes during the war. Top military brass in Washington, D.C. were pleased to find that they were not faced with the chaos of hundreds of thousands of uncontrollable individuals, but rather with a tight, obedient military unit in which each rank was responsible to its direct superior for its actions. This disciplinary tactic seemed sound to our captors, but it led to a disastrous strengthening of German militarism and Nazism inside the camps. News of the war was accessible to us in the New York Times, which published the communiques of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Japanese, the Germans, and the Soviets. Over time I began to get closer to the truth. Exaggerations of successes and the downplaying of losses and setbacks occurred on both sides. I remembered my Uncle Hani listening to the radio in Germany and telling me, "There's an old saying, the first casualty of war is truth." On days we didn't get the newspaper, Rolf and I speculated on the reason for its absence. The Allies must have had a setback, Rolf would say, or our side must have won a battle. For a change, the only worthwhile news came from my family. Now that we were allowed to send letters through the International Red Cross, I wrote to my parents in Kiel on airmail forms which were similar to the light paper airmail forms of today. My mother wrote back immediately, since she knew that letters took months to be delivered. Both sides censored the mail. One side blacked out words and the other side cut them out. All that was usually left were greetings and personal information. Mother's letters were always cheerful and supportive.